Shalom. This week's Sedra Ki Tavoh. There are certain structures that people have built over the years that take one's breath away when seeing them in person. The Statue of Liberty, the Egyptian pyramids, and the Hoover Dam are just some examples of stunning human structures. People build mind-blowing edifices for all kinds of reasons, but mostly to make an impression on future generations. In this week's Torah portion, we read about God's command to build one of three rock formations that will leave an impression for all time. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that these rock formations have lasted. We don't see them in Israel today. We read in this week's Torah portion, Moshe and the elders charged the people, saying, "Observe all the mitzvot that I command you today. As soon as you have crossed the Jordan River into the land that your God is giving you, you shall set up large stones. Coat them with plaster and inscribe them with all the words of the Torah." Our scholars have debated what was written on the rocks that God told Moshe and the Jewish people to erect. In his commentary to the Torah, Rav Saadiah Gaon maintained the principles of the Torah, Klalei HaTorah, were listed on the stones. The Ibn Ezra quoted Rav Saadiah Gaon, but recorded his position differently than the understanding that we just said. Ibn Ezra said that the 613 commandments in a list were listed upon the stones. Ramban quoted in the book of Tagin that the entire Torah was written on the stones, from the beginning of Bereshit to the very end of Zot HaBracha. It is likely that either these stones were huge or it was a miraculous event, for otherwise it would have been impossible to inscribe so much on so few stone tablets. These three different scholars have three different opinions about what was written on the rocks. Don't make the mistake and think that the scholars were simply debating what was written on the rocks. Their true debate is the purpose of the rocks. The debate over what was written on the rocks is just alluding to the true debate, the purpose of the rocks. Until this point in our reading of this week's Torah portion, we know God has commanded the Jewish people to set up rocks that could possibly have the entire Torah written on them, and maybe even in 70 languages. These rocks would have been miles long along the coast of the Jordan River. This seems difficult to understand in a literal sense. The meaning behind these rocks must be of crucial importance. A few verses later, the Torah states, Moshe and the Kohanim spoke to all the Jews, saying, "Nation of Israel, listen. Today you have become the nation of your God." What made the Jewish people the nation of God on that very day? Besides erecting the rocks, the Jewish people took an oath to keep the Torah that day. The Chizkuni explained that the Jewish people became the nation of God as a result of having accepted the laws of the Torah with a solemn oath. The rocks weren't just a listing of the mitzvah or even the entire Torah. They were a reminder to future generations of the Jewish people's oath of commitment to keep the Torah, and that it is through the Torah they become the nation of God. Rav Saadiah Gaon felt that the principles of the Torah would best remind the Jewish people because it is the principles that we apply to modern situations that best reflects observing the Torah. Ibn Ezra understood the list of the 613 mitzvot reminds the Jewish people of what their oath entails. And Ramban explained, nothing short of the entire Torah would suffice to remind the Jews what is required to fulfill their oath to observe the mitzvot and be the nation of God. These are important lessons for us, the Jews who the rocks were intended to remind of how our commitment requires us to lead our lives. What a fascinating lesson. Shabbat Shalom.